You're listening to the Book Talk Today podcast, a podcast that inspires readers to obtain valuable insights to inform, educate, and improve lives. My name is Orn Abdi. I'm an avid reader, best known for the creation of the 1 Minute Book Review community, and I'm sitting down with authors to delve deeper into the books they have written to uncover the story behind the story. Hello everyone and welcome back to another episode of the Book Talk Today podcast. Today we are joined by Justin Marozzi. Justin is a travel writer, historian, journalist and communications expert. Justin is a regular contributor to a wide range of national and international publications where he writes on international affairs, the Muslim world, defense and security issues. And today we'll be discussing his book, Islamic Empires, the Cities That Shaped Civilization from Mecca to Dubai. Justin, it's a pleasure to have you on.
Thank you very much, Orn. Very good to join you.
Thank you so much for accepting. And as someone who loves to read about history, and it's particularly Islamic history, being a Muslim, I found your book to be incredibly insightful. And I like when they go through, history books go through time and you get to see changes and adaptations from different places to one another and some of the similarities. One of the things I couldn't help wondering when reading the book, though, is that there were so many cities that were once gleaming, and you gave beautiful descriptions of many of the cities that are now shadows of their former selves, which was a very interesting theme within the book. So before we get into some of the topics and some of the cities, I think it'd be great for you to speak about your experiences in visiting these countries and really what you gained from visiting them and spending time there.
Yeah, there's such a cross-section here in that list of 15 cities for each of the centuries of Islam. Obviously, I should probably begin by saying there are two I did not visit of the 15. One obviously is Mecca, which for non-Muslims is obviously not a possibility. Although interestingly, every now and then there is talk, and I heard something that supposedly Mohammed bin Salman was laying out possibilities of some sort of tourism opportunities for non-Muslims in Mecca. Who knows? Maybe that'll happen. Maybe it won't. But the other one was Isfahan, which has been on my list for many years, and I just haven't made it there yet. But I would absolutely love to. All the others are just, I think, enormous favourites of mine as world cities. Almost all of them, traditionally Muslim cities, and some of them have changed, like Constantinople, Christian Constantinople becoming Muslim Istanbul. But I mean, almost every one, as you say, in their time, gleaming metropolises. Many of them, sadly, are certainly past their best. But I deliberately, I think, tried to end on a more positive and a very contemporary note with the 20th and 21st centuries, with Dubai and Doha, quite similar modern histories, but also with a number of differences in possibly the ruling family's approach to building a modern city as well. Dubai traditionally very open. The Maktoum family's ambition, very bold, daring, almost like a gamble in the desert. Build it and they will come. And I remember talking to an Emirati. He said, the Maktoums bet the farm on this. They borrowed big, they went big, and it's paid off. And the Doha, more possibly more conservative, more aware of the dangers of building a city in which the Muslim population becomes very quickly a minority in its own city. I think both Dubai and Doha had that experience, and it's interesting. And for some people, find it quite uncomfortable. The economic success has come possibly at some cultural cost. To be a minority of 5 to 10% in your own sort of city, state, or country is not great necessarily for everyone involved. So those were quite contrasts, I think. I mean, I'm often asked, which are my favourite cities, and I have to say pretty much, and it's the wrong answer, but all of them.
Yeah. I can imagine it's like choosing a favourite child. You just can't do
versus Fez, Samarkand. Tripoli is a long-term favourite of mine, simply really because of family background more than anything. My father used to take me there when I was a teenager. He used to do business in Tripoli. And I've just grown to love it. And I think one of the reasons I wanted to write this book as well, because, then in that 10 years since the Arab Spring, as we all know, it's been a terrible crisis for much of the region, and these cities and countries have just had undergone incredible challenges and difficulties. So, swathes of Damascus, this fabulous former Umayyad capital, have literally been in rubble. Kabul, which I'm sure we'll come to in a moment, when I first went in '96, was just recovering. Well, it wasn't even recovering. It had just emerged from several years of mujahideen, intra-mujahideen fighting within the city, and I'd never seen scenes like it. The destruction was something out of an apocalypse, war movie or something. And the Taliban had just taken over. It was 4 months into their control of the capital city. And then, the last 20 years, Kabul, and I'm not really talking so much about the country, but the city itself picked itself up again. And now, as we speak, things are going back to the Taliban. And I've spent much of this morning before speaking to you writing to desperate Afghan colleagues and friends who said, please, can you write me recommendation letters? I need to get to the airport. And we seem to have come full circle. Ahmed Massoud Jr. sending out appeals to the international community to fund his resistance against the Taliban, something his father did against the Soviets from 79 to 89, and it's an extraordinary period. But I didn't want to write another sort of doom and gloom Middle East reporter sort of book. I wanted to go back to the history and also maybe to try to think about what made these cities great in different eras. But it's 1,500 years, so it's a long chunk of time, and I think there are some themes and lessons that come out of it as well.
Yeah, definitely. So to move on to talk about Kabul, I think one of the quotes that you put in the book about Kabul was by Ibn Battuta, I think, was once a large city, but is now, for the most part, in ruins. And it seems like to be a very poignant and timely quote, given what's happened recently. So can you just talk about how your experiences, I know you mentioned it briefly, of visiting Kabul and some of the history behind it and how this situation has come to pass again?
Yeah, I first went to Kabul as basically a cub reporter on my way to a job in the Philippines for the Financial Times in 1996, 4 months into Taliban control. And it was kind of like a busman's holiday. And I had a letter of introduction to Ahmed Shah Massoud, which I thought would never come to anything. And to cut a long story short, we finally interviewed him on the front line in his headquarters north of Kabul, and he talked about his poetry, love of poetry, Hafez, very cultured man, very open to journalists, which unfortunately proved his undoing when he was killed by Al Qaeda two days before 9/11. It was by a fake camera crew, because that was his weakness. He was open to the media and to communicating his ideas, but an incredibly charismatic and impressive man. And it was an act of kind of malevolent brilliance to kill him just before 9/11, so that Afghanistan was denied his leadership, possibly after those attacks. But I've been going on and off since then, sometimes as a consultant, sometimes as a writer. I was researching a book about Tamerlane years ago as well, and did a sort of a tour of Afghanistan through Kabul into Bamiyan. I think I was there 3 weeks before the Taliban destroyed the famous Buddha of Bamiyan, up to Mazar-e Sharif and down to Herat. And Herat's a reminder of the rich Islamic culture in Western Afghanistan. In Afghanistan itself, the love of poetry, the arts, the literature. Many things which the Taliban today would profess to be un-Islamic are a deep part of Afghan and Herati culture. And then continuing south into Kandahar, where it was it was a scarier place than I remember, and I wasn't necessarily welcome. And there were some I wasn't really aware of this, but there were Arab training camps. And you felt some of the Afghans I was with were felt under siege and were intimidated by the presence of these Arab foreign fighters, which none of us knew much about in those days. But I think to see what's happening now is an utter tragedy. And that famous line about we learning from history, what we learn from history is that we don't learn from history, which is why we are where we are in Kabul. But unfortunately, it's all very well for us to sit here talking about Western power and strategic balance shifting and so on. But it's the Afghans who once again will pay this terrible price. And I just think part of it, I think, is also geography, that they have, Afghanistan has uniquely difficult neighbours. The West is one thing, and then the immediate neighbours, and so they always find themselves the centre of these proxy wars. And the tragedy, I think, is I don't see that is suddenly going to go away. Pakistan, Iran, Russia, the West are still going to want to remain involved in one way or another. And I think it is a disaster. I'd love to think that Taliban version 2.0 will be very different from the previous one, but I think it's wishful thinking.
I definitely think it's wishful thinking, but I also think it's the fact that when they turn around and they say that it's sort of Taliban 2.0, it almost seems as if it's somewhat like a Trojan horse in the respect that, you know, they're putting this outer image, but inside the ideology is exactly the same. The ideology is not going to change. The ideology is exactly the same. Whatever they say, you can almost sort of
Yeah,
disregard it to
and
a
I think
degree.
why should the ideology change? Because in their view, much of it is based on historical interpretations of the faith and appropriate behaviours politically, culturally, and so on, and attitudes towards women and so on. I think it's crazy of external commentators to think in 20 years' time it's suddenly going to be totally different. Yes, that we have mobile phones now, there's social media and so on, but so what? I was interested in some of my Afghan colleagues' reactions because I'd been working as an advisor to the government in the last couple of years on the media side and working in the government media information centre. And when the Taliban held their first press conference, one of my former colleagues and friends WhatsApped me. He said, "I can't. This is so strange watching this. There are terrorists in our office now holding a press conference." But I don't know how much of that view is Kabul middle class elite as well. And I mean, I think, you know, we can't necessarily say that the Taliban has no support. It's lived on for 20 years. There are parts of the country which are conservative and rural, and you know they have no interest in that particular government as well. Was, you know, it wasn't a great government for most Afghans, and you know there are so many people to blame here, aren't there? Really. I don't like the American way of saying it's all the Afghan government, security forces didn't fight, etc., etc. I think the blame goes everywhere.
Yeah. Yeah, it definitely goes everywhere. And I think I went to go see my granddad yesterday, and he spent a lot of time in Pakistan as well. So he got displaced from the partition from India into Pakistan. So, and we were speaking yesterday about the role that Pakistan plays and the ideology that Pakistan, specifically in Pakistan, and it sharing a border with Afghanistan, and that being a factor in it as well. It seems to me to be the fact, and a theme within your book is the fact that in times where cities were prosperous is when ideologies were able to coexist peacefully. Whereas in times where they can't, it's almost like you have a ruling elite of conservative thinkers, and everyone who goes against them gets either killed or beheaded or just gets silenced.
Yes, yes. That's really interesting. I think I'm just thinking Baghdad. I think is one of the examples, but there are others of what maybe we these days we over here would think, or well, West or non-Western, Muslim and non-Muslim, would think pretty dissolute, louche, decadent behaviour was just par for the course in some of these great courts, and Abbasids especially the poetry, the feasting, the banqueting, the revelry, the witty one-liners, the repartee. It's for me, it comes across as incredibly self-confident. This sort of resplendent, we're all powerful. You can be a conservative cleric here, but don't think you're gonna run the show, because that's not how we want to have this. You know, our imperial culture. It is open to all. It's open to ideas. It's open to the best ideas the world can bring. People will come to us because, you know, we this is Baghdad. This is the world. This is the great city of the world. It doesn't sort of export its people, like, you know, places like Kabul now will be literally exporting its people, which is a tragedy. People don't want to stay there; they want to leave. A lot of them. When these cities like, you know, Damascus, Baghdad, Cairo, Fez attracted people because they were literally open to ideas, open to trade, open to migrants. And that was the time, I suppose, when that part of the world, geographically it's a large area, but, you know, the Dar al-Islam in the North Africa, the Middle East, and parts of Central Asia was just much, you know, more in the ascendancy than it has been today. So I think the tolerance and the openness, the obverse of that coin is, you know, defeat leading to greater intolerance and more conservative ways of thinking. I mean, if you hear the one of the imam in the Grand Mosque of Mecca talking about Jews and Christians in an incredibly pejorative way, that's important, because people look to their spiritual leaders for guidance and views. And it fascinates me that the culture in, say, ninth century Baghdad was more tolerant, open, and cosmopolitan than, say, 21st century Mecca. And the span in time is between that 1,200 years difference. So I love reading these writers. Jahiz, the prose stylist, who wrote stuff that would probably have his head cut off in many parts of the world. Incredibly risque stuff, but it wasn't invented today. This is 1,200 years ago.
I think the interesting thing as well is me being a Muslim, understanding the history of the different sects. So the Shia and the Sunni diversion. I think the death of the Prophet was a massive turning point in the history of Islam, and its ramifications are really being seen now with the Taliban and different forms like ISIS and the Ismailis as well. There's different sect within Shia Islam. So was that a running theme throughout the book as well, as being the differences in the sects of Islam?
I think it is, yes, and I have to say immediately that I'm no great theologian or expert in this area at all. But yeah, I think that was certainly one of the themes. I remember having discussions with Iraqis when I first went to Baghdad in 2004. It was a year into the U.S. invasion / occupation / liberation, and the gloves were coming off after the initial sort of honeymoon period. It was now the beginning of the Al-Qaeda-led insurgency. And some Iraqis would say to me, under Saddam Hussein, that there was no Sunni and Shia. We were all Iraqis. And I listened to that with great interest. And then when I started to research the book on a history of Baghdad, which is a much newer city, by the way, than many of us think. It was founded in 762, but it's much less ancient than many of the ancient urban settlements in Mesopotamia. But I came across this extraordinary story of how when Mansur, the founder of Baghdad, died, he left a crypt full of corpses, each one with a little leather tag in the ear detailing the person's genealogy. This is men, women, and children. It's a macabre story, but every single one of them was a Shia Muslim. And that story is from, say, 766. Today, in Baghdad, as we speak today on your podcast, Orhan, Iraqis are involved in a debate about Mansur's statues being destroyed. Is he a symbol of Sunni supremacy, or is he a national figure? Is he a figure of Iraqi history? That debate is being had now, and it's really interesting. But I think when I was sort of accused as a Westerner of having invented this schism between Sunni and Shia, I sort of came to the conclusion, no, maybe under Saddam Hussein it was subsumed under sort of, repressed under with a very strong dictatorship. But the Western invasion had reignited that, but it certainly didn't invent it.
Oh, definitely didn't.
I think
definitely
one of the
didn't
tragedies
invent
of
it.
Iraq. Yeah, it didn't invent it. I mean, and there's an obvious parallel. Catholics, Protestants in the Christian world. I think it's a very human thing. It's as much Muslim as it is Christian. It's a human thing. But I live in a little village in Norfolk called Walsingham. Behind this house is a little Russian Orthodox church. There are Greek Orthodox, there are Armenians, there are Catholics, there are Protestants. Each of them are different sects. I think it's just a very human thing, and unfortunately, that very divisive tendency spikes occasionally at moments of crisis. And in 2003 onwards in Iraq, that was unleashed complete turmoil, obviously across Iraq, but way beyond as well. And the Sunni Shia thing, I think, has been really reignited tragically as well, because if you think about the contemporary jihads, for me at least, Muslims are the greatest victims of these jihads. I remember in Iraq mostly it was Muslims killing Muslims, and that was desperately sad.
That is
it may be the same in Kabul.
Yeah, that seems to be a theme as well in Islamic history. It seems to be a lot of Western thinkers might think that it's Islam against the West or Islam against Christianity with the Crusades, and the jihad and the spread of Islam. But in a lot of Islamic history, it's just Muslims killing Muslims. There's very rarely do they actually, and you can see that now in a lot of countries as well, whether it's Saudi Arabia and Yemen, where they're just sort of under oppression, or whether it's even in Saudi Arabia against the king in Saudi Arabia has tried on multiple occasions not to have Shias actually visit and do Hajj pilgrimage as well. So it's like oppression of certain minorities by other ruling Islamic majorities, which is a theme as well.
Yeah, absolutely. In Bahrain as well.
Yes.
In Afghanistan, the Taliban and the Hazara. I remember in '96 terrible stories of what was happening to the Hazara communities in central Afghanistan. Torture and killings. And again, can we realistically think the Taliban are suddenly going to be incredibly well behaved now and not take it out on the Shia minority? I don't know.
I already heard stories of the last couple of weeks of the Hazaras, and there was what happened last year as well with the girls' school as well.
Yes, and I think these things I think are going to continue. For me, with this historical hat on, I was drawn to Timor, to Tamerlane, who I'd written a book about before, but I thought as one of the cities in this book about Islamic empires, the 14th century Samarkand. A kind of updated version of Baghdad from the 9th century, where again Samarkand becomes one of the great world cities, but as much based on pillaging the hell out of the other great Muslim cities of the region, Central Asia and further west, than it was about just attracting trade and migrants. But that was largely Muslim on Muslim. And Timor had no hesitation whatsoever in raising the banner of jihad again and again and again, talking about infidels very overtly. And he wasn't talking about Sunni or Shia. He was talking about infidel Franks, Christians. But I think that was a banner of convenience. He was all about conquest, and it didn't really matter to him whether it was Muslim or non-Muslim. He wanted to conquer the world, and he largely succeeded as a one-man empire. Without royal birth, unlike Alexander the Great, without one sort of ethnic people, unlike Genghis Khan, an extraordinary figure of conquest, but also culture as well. He was incredibly bloodthirsty, but we're talking about Islamic culture. What an amazing time for Islamic art and architecture. Music and literature, the Timurid period in Central Asia and Iran, and to this day those lovely, beautiful, shining blue ribbed domes of mosques and mausoleums and madrasas throughout the region all go back to that glorious period of Timurid rule. Glorious unless you were on the receiving end of his army's attacks, in which case you were toast, basically.
Yeah, not so glorious. Did
the
good. Silk Road and did the Silk Road play a role in that?
Absolutely, it did. Yes, and there was I'm trying to remember. Yes, the Spanish ambassador Rui González de Clavillo, who left an incredibly detailed account of his visit to the court of Timor in Samarkand, and he approached his visit, I think, with some of the sort of prejudices and preconceptions of a Western European at the time. He thought he was just coming to visit some barbarian. And then you can see as he goes through this empire and commenting on these trade routes being open and how you could travel from one end of Timor's empire to another with a sack of gold and you'd be completely fine because the security was so good. The postal routes were incredibly efficient with riders, staging posts and so on. So there was that sense of a Pax Timor and across the Silk Roads from west to east. And by the time he meets Timor, he's completely staggered by the opulence and majesty of this Eastern potentate. And you can watch almost like a live stream of his prejudices being turned upside down. He realizes that he's in the presence of someone for whom the King of Castile is an absolute nothing burger. Some pathetic little princeling in Western Europe when Timor is the most powerful man on the planet.
Yeah. And it seems like, especially in reference to Baghdad as well, what we were speaking about, is they were ahead of their time from whether it be, their water systems, their construction of cities. That's something you talked about in the book as well. It's like the construction of cities in the Muslim world were way ahead of their time from Western Europe, where they were still dealing with plague and hygiene issues. And I think there was a quote as well in Constantinople. I think you mentioned the fact that the Muslims saw their Western counterparts as being like rude of tongue, ugly. Like they just didn't see their Western counterparts as unhygienic, stuff like that. So it seems as if the Islamic cities were way ahead in the terms of development than their Western counterparts.
I think that's completely right. I'm thinking about Cordoba, another city we haven't mentioned. In the 10th century, Cordoba was about 5 times the size of London and Paris, and on a par with Constantinople. It's a city that we don't know so much about today, possibly, but that was, again, one of the great cities, a city famed for the richness of its libraries, again, resplendent culture, lots of poetry, art and music, very largely positive, what was called in Spanish, convivencia between Muslims, Jews and Christians. And again, for me, the obvious theme there was that sense of tolerance and openness, sponsored by the ruling emirate, or the caliphate of Cordoba. And that, across the ages, seems to me, when these Islamic empires are in the ascendancy, on the front foot, tolerance and openness go hand in hand with that imperial power. And it's when the tide turns, and I think in my book, rereading it, it's around the 17th century and Isfahan, when the balance of power between West and East starts to shift, and you get these sort of businessmen, traders, inventors, scientists coming to the court of Shah Abbas with these sort of newfangled advices, scientific measurement machines, dodgy commercial prospects, building all sorts of projects for Shah Abbas, and you can sense the tide is starting to turn now, and that the West is building up strength. But that's about 1,000 years after the start of Islam. So I think if we look at the history of these cities in the region, for most of this 1,500 years, it has been the Islamic world that has been in the ascendancy, and it's only, like I say, around the 17th century that balance starts to shift. But it's an interplay between two cultures, two worlds that I think still resonates in the 21st century, obviously, as well.
Yeah, with Cordoba as well. So I had the chance to visit Cordoba, probably over a decade ago now. And the thing that interests me is it almost feels like you're in the Middle East in Spain. It's an incredible place to visit. But it's almost really interesting for me to the fact that I think it was Abd Rahman, I think the third, who gathered support and was in Cordoba, if I'm not mistaken. And it was how he was able to gather support during that time. So how did Cordoba gain such a place, and how was he able to gather support so far away from the central Islamic
it's a really
territory? Good
question, and I think it's very difficult to answer. I think I'd probably go back right to the beginning of how even Muslims came to the Iberian Peninsula. And when I think it was 750, when the Umayyads were brought crashing down by the Abbasids, who then took over leadership of the Islamic world, there was a concerted effort to destroy every single member of the Umayyad family, and largely, with the exception of one prince who escaped west, they were successful, and the Umayyads were destroyed. The tombs were exhumed, bodies were exhumed from tombs, skulls were used as target practice. The Abbasids really went to town to erase the Umayyads from history, essentially. But I think it was 5 years this surviving Umayyad prince, travelling west, harried along the way by assassination squads who were trying to get him, but finally made his way to the Iberian Peninsula, and then essentially establishes an offshoot, a sort of like a splinter emirate, which became I wouldn't call it a rival caliphate, but an independent caliphate in the west. It was the original invasion dates to 711, so this is a little bit later, but he arrives to find an embryonic, I'm not even sure if it was a Muslim state at that point, but the early armies had been very successful in a very short period of time. And this caliphate sort of grows organically and becomes this little enclave of high culture, military power, cultural attraction. Jews and Christians are part of the story as well. It's quite small. It doesn't have an empire itself, but it's a sort of self-contained Muslim polity on the Iberian Peninsula, and again the commonality it has with some of these other cities, that there's the sense of openness, tolerance, trading might. These cities and city-states are multinational, multi-ethnic, multilingual, multicultural, and I think they draw their strength from that. And so the Caliphate of Cordoba mirrors many of these other cities at their pomp. Fatimid Cairo or Abbasid Baghdad, Umayyad Damascus, in a smaller scale. But I think also that the Al-Andalus still resonates in many Muslim minds and histories with a sort of sense of regret and longing, because it was a great culture that lasted for several hundred years on the Iberian Peninsula before the Reconquista, which culminated in quite brutal ways, 1492, with the expulsion of Jews and Muslims from the peninsula across into North Africa and what is now Morocco.
I always go back to, I think you mentioned that quote in the book by Herodotus, is that how you pronounce the name correctly? Human prosperity never abides long in the same place.
Yeah, I love that. Herodotus, and
Herodotus.
I think I was writing about him again recently with regard to American power. And what's just happened to America in Afghanistan. On paper, you've got this ragtag motley army of 70,000, some of them, peasant boys and, not particularly well equipped, against supposedly the mightiest army in the world. And Herodotus has a line as well about, human fortune never abides long in one place, for God likes to strike the lofty, more than the low. And small cities become big cities decline, empires rise and fall. And I think, in some ways, we're being treated to like a live stream of imperial decline as well. Some people say that that's too exaggerated, but I think this is that moment in Afghanistan, it has enormous importance. And for anyone who thinks that is not a big sort of strategic full stop or semicolon or big juncture in history, I think is kidding themselves. And many people, the Taliban and their supporters around the world, I think, are jubilant because they think they've sent the world's great superpower packing
so quickly as well. It's not just the
quickly,
fact that they did it.
20 years, yeah. It's a week. It's absolutely extraordinary.
It is.
But I think Herodotus would have seen that in that cycle of empires coming and going. Empires don't last forever.
And that's something that I think gives perspective when you read something like your book or read more history, ancient history towards empires. Dictators come and go, despots come and go. It's just the cycle of life, it seems. So they don't last.
I don't think they last. And when we look back on that period of 20 years, I wonder how different it will seem to what comes next in Afghanistan. Women's rights, I think, is an interesting aspect of this because we've seen all these heartrending stories from Kabul of, female politicians, activists, and women in the workplace with these terrible stories of how terrified they are now and what's going to happen next under the Taliban. And I just wonder whether that will look like a little strange blip in Afghan history, which was more to do with foreign values being imposed by the West, or perhaps it will be seen as a harbinger of better times. But there's no way that the Taliban are going to be looking to women leaders. There was an interview with one fighter, and it was a female journalist asking him about what happens if will women be allowed to be elected under the Taliban, and he just laughed and said, "Can you stop the recording?" He burst into laughter because in his mind that's the most absurd suggestion. Women are not going to be allowed that role in public life. But how the difference between women in Kabul and women across the country, I think, is something that is perhaps not as understood as it could be. And that whole scene in Kabul looks quite unreal with regard to what the rest of Afghanistan has looked like in the last 20 years, when many communities have lived in fear of this, endless fighting. I heard a professor friend on the radio today talking about what life might be like in Afghanistan, and he's saying, for women, their opportunities will be really severely limited. What happens under dictatorships is people survive, but their options become much more limited. And I've got a nasty feeling his analysis is going to be pretty right. These are not going to be fun times.
Yeah, it's not going to be prosperous, but it'll be very much just be how can we survive through day to day rather than think about sort of future prosperity.
And I suspect some people, including the Taliban, will make fortunes and make improper use of funding and so on and so forth, and the opium trade, trafficking of women, or having this sort of horrendous stories of sex slaves and things. I think these are going to be kind of part of the discourse on Taliban governance if they don't want to change that mode of behavior.
But that was always a theme, though, in Islamic history. In the book, you talk about the impact that markets had, or slave trade, or just the trade in general in Islamic empires, and how each city, sort of the center of each one of these major cities, was their trade. Even if different countries or different regions were at war with one another, they would allow trade openly between one another. So that just seems to be a theme as well, where trade and exchange of money and resources has always been there in Islamic empires, and that will never stop.
Yeah, I think that's right. And Kabul, obviously it's a much poorer part of the world than many of its neighbours. Babur, in his one of my favourite books, original sources in this for the study of this book, is called the Baburnama, the Memoirs of Babur. And again, talking about a sort of what might seem dissolute and decadent and un-Islamic. Here's the founder of the Mughal Empire with the sort of 30 years of diaries, talking about hashish, his reservations about drinking wine, should he or shouldn't he? He's always been tempted, but not sure. Loves his poetry, loves horse riding, loves conquest. And when he writes about Kabul, he makes incredibly detailed notes about trade, the volume of horses, the different agricultural products, because he knows that trade needs to be the foundation of some, in the imperial state that he wants to build. It needs to be open. I don't know with what's going to happen in Kabul now in terms of trade, though, because I think they're going to be things like sanctions. They're going to be all sorts of prohibitions. I suppose there's going to be a lot of illicit trade, and the Taliban maybe think of themselves as devout Muslims who don't drink alcohol, but their involvement in the opium trade, I think we can have a think about the hypocrisy in that as well. But yeah, you're right. Trade.
But hypocrisy's always been a thing, because even in Baghdad, I mean, they would consider themselves the representatives of God through the caliphate, but then they'd be openly drinking in the
large glasses of Shiraz red wine. There. Absolutely, and poetry celebrating it as well. The genre of wine poetry is a thing. Abu Nuwas, the poet, writing verses which was in parts of the Muslim world today completely scandalous. And the poets in those days, I think, were quite brave figures. That a line or two too cheeky, and they could literally have their head cut off. Or if you make the caliph laugh, suddenly he throws a leather bag full of gold and dinars at you, and you're made for life. There are lots of these moments where these poets' lives really hang in the balance. But talk about free speech. There was some incredibly rude stuff that we the words that I couldn't use on this podcast with you today, because they're so rude.
Yeah, I was reading some of those, and I thought they're pretty debaucherous. Cheeky, some of those comments,
talking about women's anatomy and all sorts of things, and relationships between men and boys. Quite brazen, actually.
Yeah, definitely. And it seemed like it was sort of, I think in the book as well, I can't remember which city, but you talked about sort of ancient reality TV was born in those courts between individuals.
You mean with poetry competitions, or I'm not sure what that reference is.
It was in reference to, I think, poetry competitions, but it was also individuals that had sort of relationships with one another, but then had public feuds as well, and used poetry as their vices.
Yeah, and sort of, poets maybe shopping each other and saying, so you realize what he was doing last night, and whose chamber he'd been in, and suddenly the person,
Yeah.
a knock on the door, and the executioner's sword comes out. Yeah, the court intrigues actually aren't a million miles away from the 1001 Nights, which of course are made up legends and myths, but they're based a little bit on the court culture. Harun al-Rashid, probably we know him better from the 1001 Nights than we do from more historical sources. But you have that sort of sense of adventure, charismatic leadership, drinking, feasting, and a sense of self-confidence and power. Because this is the greatest city in the world. Islam is the greatest faith in the world, and this is the Abbasids, the greatest empire in the world, and it's all a display, I suppose, of imperial self-confidence, which is so different now to the more defensive cultures in some parts of the region. When for obvious reasons, but the crises that are think about Damascus today, that very grim dictatorship under two generations of Assads. The sort of contemporary jihadists, Western involvement again, Beirut as well, and a city we haven't mentioned yet, absolutely on its knees economically, a political class that is seen as corruption off the scale, a city that was the sort of playground of the Middle East, the Paris of the Middle East, just reduced to abject misery, again in a very brief period of time. Beirut interested me because that was where my father was born in 1938, and I remember him always being very devastated by the destruction of the Civil War, 1975 to 90. Then there was that period where it was rebuilt, but then there have been subsequent conflicts with Israel, and now just awful stories, really. And that bomb in the explosion in the port.
Yeah.
Seemed to encapsulate all the horror stories, the neglect, the negligence, the poor safety, and the zero accountability as well. Leading Lebanese to increasingly, you see on Twitter Lebanese saying, "I've never thought I'd say this, but I'm leaving. There's nothing for me here." The opposite thing that we were talking about earlier, when these cities attract the world,
Yeah.
whereas now, sadly, too many of them are exporting their populations.
Yeah, with Beirut as well, I think recently was the fact that they had another explosion in a petroleum, another explosion where that was sort of somewhere similar to the lack of safety of accountability. But it's also the water shortages now that they have there. Like, people don't have petrol, they don't have water. It's just sort of the basic necessities of a country is just not being fulfilled, which is very sad, to be fair. And I think in the book as well, you talk about, it seems like Beirut had a very sectarian view between East and West. It's sort of like that clash was very, very big in Beirut.
I can't remember the exact number. It's either 18 or 21 or something like that. That the constitution recognizes as the different sects, different minorities, and it's a rather tragic, I suppose, example of how a strength of a community, that multi-faith, multi-ethnic, multicultural mosaic of communities, is both its strength and its weakness. At its best, all these communities live very happily together, rubbing shoulders. Different Muslim communities alongside different Christian communities, but then when something, possibly an external crisis, affects the country, Lebanon, often it's Syrian intervention, that precarious sort of balance and harmony between the different communities completely breaks down, and it's sort of neighbor against neighbor. And there are some examples in the 19th century where you see Beirutis turning upon each other, and suddenly the streets are running with blood. So yeah, I think it seems to me a place that is easily shattered, but that it always rebuilds itself. I remember working in Baghdad at that same time from 2004, and then you'd be seeing Lebanese businessmen coming in selling helicopters to whoever wanted them, and that they have that irrepressible trading culture, which I think romantically you can say is a latter day version of the ancient Phoenicians who are sailing around the Mediterranean selling their wares. But I think there is something in that continuity, that love of trade and business, and I hope that kind of engine of prosperity can crank into life again to help lift Lebanon out, because it's really in a pit and only sinking fast. Terribly sad, yeah.
And one of the other cities, the second to last one, I think you talked about Dubai, which has been a fascinating place over the past, since the 1950s, really, when they had that small. You put the map in the book, had that small bit, and it's grown really quickly over that period of time. But I almost think, like many of the cities, they have this outer opulence. There's like the big buildings, big shiny buildings, the trade markets, everything. But really at the underbelly, there's this darkness in there. And I feel like Dubai is one of those places where it has the opulence, but if you look below the surface,
Do you mean
there's some darkness in there.
like a darkness involving the workers
Yeah, the human rights and
and
how
modern,
they treat people and
accusations
all
of
that
modern
kind of
slavery
stuff.
and
Yeah.
so on? Yeah, I think that it is for me,
Yeah.
looking at modern cities, Dubai is right up there as one of the most interesting case studies, because, as you're saying, not that long ago, it was a little village in the desert, fishing community, a little bit of agriculture, camels, lineages of tribes that go back a long way, but just not on the international stage. And there's a lovely line from one of the Maktoums. He wanted the word Dubai to be known around the world. And when he said that was just a completely laughable idea. Who would know this little village in the Gulf, on a creek? There's nothing to know about it. And so quickly, the idea of build it and they will come, against all the advice, by the way, much of it British. I love this sort of series of very pompous British officials saying, "Oh, you don't want to do that, Sheikh Maktoum. That you don't need an airport. We've got one here, up the road for you. You don't need to do that. You don't need to build this. You don't need to build that. No, no, no. That's not a good idea at all." And successive Maktooms just politely dismissing this advice and saying, "No, this is what we're going to do. We're going to build Dubai into a world city." And they succeeded. As you say, there is another side to it, obviously, which is the less rosy and optimistic side of the people who have made this happen, and the workers, and the stories of passports being taken and workers held in camps.
Yep.
I think there's that view as well, though, is also described as Dubai bashing, and you see in my research I came across some Emirati writers who say this is typical Western Dubai bashing. We've made something special, and all you can do is knock our achievements. You're jealous. You use workers to build your skyscrapers. Why can't we do the same here? And it's double standards. It's Western hypocrisy. So I think that there is an ongoing debate. There is certainly a darker side. You can see the sort of the workers who are at the bottom of the pile, building these amazingly gleaming hotels and malls and skyscrapers for the world's rich, really. I think that it's kind of a shocking contrast between the rich and the poor there. But for me, without a sort of a preconceived notion, it's, as a city case study, I think it is absolutely fascinating. And the word sustainability, is Dubai sustainable? Can it just keep growing? If your model is only just keeping growing, how sustainable is that? How many air conditioners are you going to need? How many desalination plants are you going to need? How much power are you going to be consuming? If Emiratis don't like to buy a second-hand apartment, whereas in the UK that's just completely normal. Some of them like to buy a brand new apartment every time they move. Where's that going to end? Is there going to be any desert left eventually? So that and at the same time as it keeps growing, your average Emirati is becoming a smaller and smaller minority in the UAE or in the city of Dubai. So it's a work in progress, but there are all sorts of questions about identity that I think are being posed on an ongoing basis. So it's an interesting laboratory. But what I think is interesting with the historical hat on, again, is the fact that it is open. It wants to attract the world, and people go to it. And I remember having spent time in Iraq before I went to Dubai for a longer research trip. all the Iraqis were very snobby about Dubai. They're saying it's nothing. You know, they're peasants. They've got no history. We're an ancient culture. We used to rule the world. Those Emiratis in Dubai, they're just sort of nouveau riche. They've got nothing about them. And then a few weeks later, talking to an Emirati academic, she just sort of said, stop that. Find me a Sudanese, an Algerian, a Moroccan, an Iraqi who doesn't want to live in Dubai. They all do. And I thought that was, spot on. It's all very well dwelling on your ancient glories and your ancient histories, but Dubai is here and now. It's not persecuting its populations in anything like the way that an Egyptian in Cairo is under President Sisi, or under the old Libya of Gaddafi, and so on and so forth. Assad, Syria. Dubai offers people a more open place to live and make their fortunes, no questions asked. So, it's a complicated place, but and it's certainly not to everyone's taste. But I just love it as a case study of a modern city. And is it an Islamic city? Is it an Arab city? Is it a global city? It's kind of all of those, and none of them. It's utterly fascinating.
Definitely, it's definitely impressive. It's definitely impressive. And I visited Qatar a couple of years ago, Doha particularly, specifically, and it does feel like you visit there. There's full of these restaurants and these sort of French Riviera style houses and apartments and stuff that's just built obviously on the sand, and it's just very interesting because they have the traditional dress. And then you walk and you sort of go into like a restaurant and stuff, and it just feels very interesting. I like the dynamic. It'd be interesting to see, like you said, how long it lasts for. But I think it's interesting while it lasts to have that dichotomy.
Yeah, I think it feels like a more Islamic city as you experience it than Dubai. But then I think the Dubai's answer to that would be, well, we're completely international. We're both Islamic, Muslim, and international. What you can't just say because everyone needs to be wearing dish dashers, or you have mosques and minarets everywhere. That only that is a Muslim city. We are a completely Muslim city, open to the world, like Baghdad was, 1,200 years ago or something.
Yeah,
so
yeah.
It is fascinating because what is a modern Islamic city? Both those cities would say we are. And they're both right as well, in different ways. Because I think that's there isn't one model, is there? I mean, that's I suppose one of the points as well.
Yeah. What have you ever foreseen or had to think about what a 22nd century Islamic city would look like?
I think I had some correspondence with Tim McIntosh Smith about that, a friend who's written a wonderful book called Arabs, a 3,000-year history. I can't remember what exactly he said, but I think, given how bad things are in much of the region, I think we'd have to construct something, much more optimistic with good governance, tolerance, excellent interfaith relations, fantastic infrastructure, no government or bureaucratic corruption, and armed forces which behaved with exemplary discipline and compassion, and construct some sort of nice fantasy land. I don't think that sort of city exists anywhere in the world, anyway. Of course, but I mean, it's difficult to say. But what would be a model Islamic city? I mean, Cairo for me is one of my favorite cities in the world, but the fact that how Egypt has turned into a really a police state on steroids makes it much less attractive, or much less of a model. If you're Egyptian and you don't expect the state to behave with justice towards you, it's people with connections who rise through the ranks. It's the military with their stranglehold on the Egyptian economy. The ordinary person hasn't got a chance in hell, really, and that's tough. But there'll be plenty of Egyptians who say, we don't want democracy if it just brings a repressive brotherhood. And they've kind of ended up with a more sort of, a repressive police military state instead. So I don't think that's much of a model either. So I think we come back to those, Dubai and Doha. I was thinking about having maybe Bradford as a 21st century example, or like a much bigger Muslim community in the West, because these are
Yeah.
equally important populations. Perhaps I should have done that in the end, but it was a very personal list, and places I've known about or travelled to, worked in, lived in, and have a particular interest in. But I also like the fact that you could probably choose, with the exception of places like Mecca, Damascus, and Baghdad. Maybe you could have a completely different list. There's no Jakarta in there. There's no Kuala Lumpur. Jakarta is the world's biggest, Indonesia, the world's biggest Muslim state. Perhaps Jakarta would have made a very interesting Islamic case study as well. So it is really just a personal list. But yeah, let's think about the 22nd century Islamic city and what it might look like and where it might be.
I where it might be, I personally think, and obviously I'm no historian, or I'm no way qualified to say this, but I think it'd be interesting to see how pockets emerge, because there's large amounts of displacement, especially from the Islamic world at the moment, obviously Kabul being one, but there's a lot of refugees from the Islamic world that's going to different pockets, whether they be, Canada, America, Australia. Like, there's a lot of movement from the Islamic
Yes.
world into different Western countries, and it's just interesting to see how communities will develop in these countries. Like you were saying about Bradford, in the UK, there's huge pockets of Muslim populations in different parts of the country, not just in one. In America, there's a big community in the Shia population in Dearborn, which has got like 100,000 Shia Muslims in Dearborn in Michigan, and that's obviously throughout the whole country. So I think that will be the interesting thing, is how these pockets in Scandinavia, there's huge populations of Muslims as well, that are there as well.
And I mean, yeah, absolutely, all over the world. Another one I'm thinking about, because I used to work in Mogadishu, and that was another city I was thinking of, how to get it in, but it was difficult to justify as like one of the sort of big world cities at any moment in its history. But when I worked in Mogadishu as an advisor to the government there about almost 10 years ago, most of my Somali colleagues were diaspora Somalis, and they were either Somali Brits, Somali Canadians, Somali Americans, and many from on the American side from Minneapolis, in Minnesota. And I'm just thinking of that Congresswoman Ilhan Omar from that community of Somali Americans. So there are Muslim communities all over the world, and as you say, in pockets, and some rising to political prominence, commercial prominence, and so on and so forth. So it's very interesting that. Whether it's actually a city is, I suppose, is a different question. But our cities, I suppose, are becoming much more multi-ethnic anyway, multi-faith and multi-ethnic. So it goes back possibly to that question of what is a modern Islamic city? What was an ancient Islamic city? If Baghdad in 1917, as recently as 1917, 40% of Baghdad was Jewish. So that's one of the oldest Jewish populations in the world. Baghdad, as an Islamic city, as an Islamic headquarters of this great empire, was multi-faith as well. It was ruled by Muslims, but with communities of Christians and Jews absolutely integral to the fortunes of the city. And I suppose, in some ways, maybe the more multi-ethnic and multi-faith communities are more in New York, London, than, say, Baghdad now. There are no Jews left. The Christian community have been decimated. Damascus, similarly, as you mentioned earlier, a lot of populations have moved and migrated due to the pressures that they've been facing. So it's the communities in the West that have become much more mixed, possibly. I mean, Baghdad, I remember when I was there, it was becoming very sectarian. Some were Sunni neighborhoods, some were Shia neighborhoods. There were literally concrete blast walls put up by the Americans and the Iraqi forces to separate, Sunni from Shia, because there was the sectarian conflict and unfathomable levels of bloodletting. Al Qaeda versus the civilian population and the armed forces. It was awful.
Yeah, it is interesting to think about what that is, because your book brings into question what is an Islamic city, or what is an Islamic empire. Is it a country or a city that is fully Islamic and everyone follows that, or is it just a open place where ideologies and knowledge and just ideas flourish, and so do different cultures and ethnicities as well. So perhaps that is the future. It's just a metropolis of different ideas that doesn't perhaps fit under the Islamic banner, but just where ideas flow.
Yeah, I think so, and I think try telling that to the Taliban, and they'll just say, "Well, that's sort of a kafir speaking," or because I would say they don't know their history, or they don't know Islamic history.
I'm a Western Muslim. Sorry, Taliban.
Yeah, and they will make all sorts of untoward accusations about you and
Yes, of
towards you,
course.
to which I would say they don't know their Islamic history. When Mehmet II took Constantinople in 1453, after 800 years of various Arab and Muslim armies failing to take the city, it was described as a bone in the throat of Allah, because it was this Christian enclave in a declining Byzantine Empire. But when Mehmet finally took Constantinople with some absolutely brilliant military maneuvers and strategy, he saw himself as its successor to the Roman emperor. And it wasn't about making everyone Muslim. It was about running an empire in which there were other faiths as well. So it was an Islamic empire, but it was also a multi-faith empire. Christians and Jews weren't just sort of infidels to be slaughtered. It was just, we are the successor to Rome. We're the great power, and we will respect these minorities because we're an imperial power, not a sort of narrowly chauvinistic Islamic state. And I think the Taliban model, I would say, is quite un-Islamic, quite unhistorical, and ignorant of the riches and glories of Islamic civilization, and that's kind of the tragedy. An respectful Islamic empire wouldn't have gone and destroyed the ancient site of the Buddhas of Bamyan, which are world civilization. It's not about faith, is it? It's about world heritage.
And that's happened in Syria, that's happened in Iraq, it's happened in so many different places where ancient
Palmyra,
yeah, that they've just destroyed them. And to me it makes no sense, because like when I read about Islamic history in reference to the Prophet in Medina specifically, is he lived peacefully alongside Jews and Christians alike and gave them rights and gave them the ability to practice their faith. So it, like, from a theological point of view and a historical point of view, it doesn't add up.
I think that some of this is ideological as well, obviously, because in my chapter about Mecca, I looked at some of the modern development of infrastructure around the holy site, the Grand Mosque.
It's very interesting.
And the sorts of historical monuments that were demolished, including the Prophet's house, the wife of Khadija, the house of Abu Bakr. These sites of extreme historical importance literally convert into things like public toilets or shopping malls. And that is Islamic history, never mind pre-Islamic history. That is Islamic history being bulldozed in the name, really, of greed and materialist excess. So if you're a wealthy Muslim, you can go to Mecca and have a hotel view over the shrine in your incredibly expensive hotel room. But again, with a historical hat on, I find that interesting, because there's some lines about the Meccans in history being, we milk the pilgrims like crops. The pilgrims are your crops, and I'm speaking to you from a little village in Walsing, which has had pilgrimage for over 1,000 years. There isn't much milking, there isn't much business, but in Mecca, they're very skilled at relieving pilgrims of their hard-earned money. But the historical stuff is serious, though, and I remember when an 18th century Ottoman fort, I think it was demolished for part of this development, and Turkey was very upset, and they called it a cultural crime against humanity. The Saudi regime not interested about that. It was about, in their mind, building Mecca to house the greater number of pilgrims in the modern age, and some things have to be sacrificed. And if it's an 18th century Ottoman fort, so be it. But I think that sort of Taliban ideology of destroying things that they see are un-Islamic is bonkers, and it does a great disservice to the Islamic history and heritage itself, because unfortunately people will think that is a kind of a modern Muslim approach to culture, which of course it isn't. It's a very narrow one in one part of the world, but it's egregious.
Yeah, I don't think it does great wonders for sectarian divides, that type of thing. That's why I think it's interesting to see what a 22nd century Islam might look like, because I don't know where the sectarian divides are going to go to, because I think it just gets enhanced between whether it be intra-Muslim ones or whether it's East and West, stuff like that. I think it just gets it's not just a building. That's the thing. Like, it's just not a clock tower. It's just not a hotel. There's a deeper message to that I don't know where the results of that end up.
And it's right overlooking, right on top of this ancient shrine, which itself predates Islam, by the way, as well as we all know.
Yes.
The Saudis
Yes, it
may
does.
not like to say that, but it goes back to the sort of the mists of time. It's so old we don't have the history for it. With the detail that we might like. I think also, we're talking about Saudi Arabia for a moment. That there's the very interesting, I think, in my mind, quite unproductive relationship historically between the ruling family and the ulama, whereby you guys do what you want, you rule the country, but you're going to have our interpretation of Islam, and it's a very strict, and it's a very particular form of Islam. But it isn't Islam. It is a part of Islam, but it's been propagated with a lot of petrodollars around the world in a way which I would say has been fairly pernicious to some, a Muslim intellectual climate in parts of the world, especially Pakistan, places like that. And it certainly doesn't propagate the view that other faiths are to be, respected or lived alongside. And I think that obviously there was blowback within Saudi, the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, but also in the wider world. And I think if you go around the world promoting a pretty restrictive and narrow interpretation of Islam, there will be consequences. There have been consequences. Of course, I'm not trying to say that the West has no role in this. The West's role with the Mujahideen and Al Qaeda has been very well documented. But the Saudi regime has played I think, a disproportionate role in propagating a very narrow and particular form of Islam, which I know that many Muslims feel, have great concerns about, because that isn't Islam. It is a part of Islam, but it's a less plural, tolerant form of Islam than you have in actually most other parts of the Muslim world, in my mind.
And I think if you understand Islamic history, you'll understand how rulers of elites and have used their money to spread a certain type of knowledge, whether it's rewriting history or whether it's using the religion for personal gain. I think that is a theme as well throughout Islamic history. It's not the religion itself as the way of ruling. It's they use personal interest and they map, or they use the religion as a vehicle for it.
Absolutely, because we're talking about people. Religion is as much human, obviously, on planet Earth as it is divine. It's interpreted, propagated, practiced by humans with all our faults and foibles. And I think on that Saudi thing as well, it is also, we've got petrodollars. We're going to propagate our version of Sunni Islam against especially our neighbor and ancient adversary, Persians versus Arabs. Shia Iran, and how many normal people have been caught up in that? It's kind of two regimes fighting each other out, using Islam as one of the channels for that cultural conflict.
And I don't know where that conflict is going to end. That's one of those conflicts that I've started ever since the death of the Prophet, and I don't know where that one's going to end. But that is a discussion for another time, Justin. I feel like. Thank you so much for taking the time to discuss elements of your book, Islamic Empires. Justin, where's the best place that individuals can find you, whether it be a website or social media?
I think Twitter is at Justin Marozzi, and a very ancient and hardly ever updated website called justinmarozzi.com. And the books, I hope, are all on Amazon and elsewhere.
Definitely. And I think before we spoke, I think you said that you had a book that had been released after this one. So this one's not the most recent one.
That's right. Yeah, this one, a much shorter book, which I'm going to plug up here for you, is a short, really kind of concise history of the Arab conquests, which I felt after all those 15 cities we looked at over 15 centuries, I want to go right back to the beginning of how the Arabs and Islam came to the world. So really the early stages, and that is another fascinating story of cultural collisions. And Islam being seen almost as a Christian heresy, the similarity between early Islam and the Christianity of the region. One God, prayer days, fasting days, pilgrimage, prayers, buildings in which prayers were said. There was a great similarity, and Islam itself was being marketed as a return to the true faith. So it's interesting now looking at it from our 21st century vantage point, but a lot of the history suggests that for contemporary Jews and Christians, Islam wasn't actually that different at all. It was possibly a return to the true faith from which those Jews and Christians had strayed. So here was a new religion that could take them back to the origins of the one God and so on and so forth.
Yes, definitely. Very interesting, because from a theological point of view, that's what Islam is seen as. It's seen as the last faith within the Abrahamic faiths, to sort of bring it all together. So very interesting. Anyway, thank you, Justin, for taking the time. I appreciate it.
Thanks very much. Real pleasure to speak to you today. Thanks so much.
Thank you for listening to this podcast. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more content. Also, visit our website, www.booktalktoday.com, to subscribe and download the latest edition of our magazine. Join our mailing list to receive the first issue for free, to get a taste for the value-packed content that we are offering. Book Talk Today, for readers, by readers.